Well, my most important teacher when it comes to social innovation and disruptive innovation was an 80-year-old homeless woman named Sarah who lived on the streets of Times Square. It's about 15 years ago that we had just completed what I thought was a project that was the definitive solution to homelessness. We turned an old hotel into a beautiful housing program for formerly homeless people, including low-income working people. And right in the building, we had social workers and mental health workers and a clinic, everything someone would need to put their lives back on track. And the building had turned out beautifully. The tenants were thriving. We were winning awards. We'd just been featured on 60 Minutes. And then I got a call from Bellevue Hospital. There was a social worker there, and in her office she had a woman who she identified as Sarah, and this woman was claiming to be my next of kin. I listened to the story, and come to find out, it was a woman that we had seen for many years on the streets of Times Square, and a very memorable woman because she was this petite, fragile-looking person who we would see from time to time dragging a milk crate across 43rd Street, and she'd go to the center of Times Square to the traffic island and sit there and just kind of stare out into space. And my colleagues and I, whenever we'd see her, we'd just be like, oh my God, we'd run out and offer her food and blankets. We'd try to figure out what to do. We would call the outreach teams. The city of New York employed social workers to try to encourage homeless people to go into shelters. So we'd call the outreach teams and we'd say, there's this lady, and they'd say, oh, we know her. Not interested in help. She's service resistant. And so we'd wring our hands, but we'd go back to work, and then that cycle would repeat itself the next time we'd see her. Well, lo and behold, this woman now wants to move into the building. So we forget the waiting list, moved her into the next available apartment. And the day she moved in, I could not wait to ask her, why did you not want our help before? And she looked back at me very sweetly and said, well, you were offering me food and blankets. You never offered me a home. And I think I stood there for a while, frankly in horror, because our failure to ask the right question had essentially condemned this woman and all of these dozens of other people we'd see regularly on the streets of Times Square. It had condemned them to probably a lifetime and an early death on the streets. And here we were celebrating the success of our program, and we had missed something so profound that we had a success for people who actually were in the program, but we had nothing to offer those who hadn't come through our doors. And so I was rattled enough that we had just really missed the big picture. So I reached outside the circle of usual suspects and hired someone to help figure this out. I hired a recently retired military intelligence officer and put her to work to try to figure out how to reduce street homelessness in Times Square by 2/3 in 3 years. Well, the day Becky showed up, things got interesting. She thought it was kind of odd that outreach took place Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, when people were actually homeless and sleeping on the street during the night. And so we're out there at 3 a.m. trying to figure out, well, actually, what's your name? What do you need? And Becky had us doing things like mapping people and getting a true picture of the size of the problem and how it shifted. And within 3 years, we had, by, in fact, rallying every resource we could muster in Times Square, we had gotten a homeless rate reduced 87%. So 3 years, 87% change. And this got some attention, as you might imagine. Not only were we getting calls from other parts of New York City, but we were starting to get calls from other cities, including Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles has the dubious distinction in this country as being the epicenter of homelessness. Much higher rates of homelessness there than anywhere else. And also within Los Angeles, there's a place, Skid Row, in downtown LA, that actually is likened to Calcutta. It's a pretty unbelievable situation there. Thousands of people in this 50-block area living in tents and boxes on the street and in and out of the many missions there. And bravely, frankly, the county and city of LA and some not-for-profit groups there wanted to try to face into this problem and asked us for help in figuring out whether what we'd done in Times Square could be applied to Skid Row. So we really leapt at the chance to try to offer something to this situation. And we got there, and we discovered pretty quickly that our program didn't translate. We really didn't have a replicable program. But we also realized, as we looked at the situation and learned, because it was a different context and different actors and different definition of homelessness, it just wasn't the same. But we thought that perhaps the process that we'd used could be applied. And indeed, that's what we proceeded to do. And if you remember nothing else I say, remember the distinction between a program and a process, because a program is a solution to a problem, but a good process is a way of finding solutions. It's a way, if it's a very good process, of applying a methodology to many problems in many contexts. And so every day of the week, it's much more valuable to have a good process than a good program. And in fact, that's what what proved to be the case. And we were able to help LA accomplish their goal of proving that they could begin moving people into housing. And the focus was getting 50 people, the most vulnerable people, people who've been on the streets the longest there, into housing and show that it could be successful. And I'm going to walk you through this process, which we think boils down to 5 things. But before I do, I want you to remember why this matters. This is a man named Ed, whom we met when we first got to LA. He'd been living on the streets of Skid Row for over 10 years. And he was one of the first 50 people we moved into housing through this project that was called Project 50, and found an apartment with this group of partners for Ed just outside Skid Row. And the interesting thing was, Ed didn't want to move in right away. He wanted to go to rehab. He volunteered. He said, you know, if he had a chance to get started on his new life, he wanted to be actually in a very different state. And 6 months later, this is who came back. It was unbelievable. But you know, this is actually not that uncommon, and that's why this matters, that we get a hold of these big problems and we apply the right processes to solve them. In the case of homelessness, it really is life and death. And so what is this process? Well, again, we think it's 5 things. The first is to focus on the outliers. Now, the outliers are the ones who don't fit the pattern. They're the ones that you tear your hair out over. It's, you know, like whatever you're doing, it just doesn't seem to work for them. And Sarah was an outlier. She'd failed in every program, every system had failed her. And yet the myth of Sarah not wanting services was blinding us in our successful program from seeing that we really hadn't solved the whole problem. And when we dug into what made Sarah and all of these people who were remaining on the street different, what we found was really shocking. You know, you would think that these folks who were not attached to any programs would actually have a very little impact on the world of homelessness in New York. But in fact, we found just the opposite. These were the individuals whom every ambulance driver, every emergency room nurse, every cop in Midtown Manhattan knew by name. They were in and out of institutions because their turmoil and their illnesses would just cause them to rely on all of these public services. I mean, they had teams of outreach workers swarming around them, and all of these resources spent, but they were moving no closer to home. And so what we found was, by digging into what was going on with the exceptions to the rule, we found that that was actually the meat of the problem, and that by facing into what was not working, that in the mainstream system, in the programs we were creating, what would work for those outliers was actually something that would work for anyone. Now, the second part of the process we see as maybe not necessarily starting with what's the strategy, but what we've learned is you set a measurable goal with a scary deadline, because it in fact is the commitment to do something significant that rallies the problem solvers, that gets people mobilized to think beyond where they've been thinking before. I hired Becky to reduce street homelessness in Times Square by 2/3 in 3 years frankly, before we had a clue how we would do it. And we signed on to help LA before we knew whether we had anything that would actually translate to their situation. And my Massachusetts friend, Don Berwick, is fond of saying frequently, "Some is not a number, and soon is not a time." Well, what this speaks to is that urgency is the mother of innovation. And where it does not exist, you actually have to manufacture it. And what we've seen over and over again in communities, that it's the power of a very urgent, shared, measurable goal that actually gets people to the breakthrough idea position, gets them moving in a direction of progress. Now next, focus on the obvious thing. Sounds crazy, but in fact, with big problems, the risk is that you give up on them early and that you start doing things that are worthy but not disruptive. And in fact, there was Sarah, plainly homeless in Times Square, and we're running around offering her blankets and food rather than focusing on the fact of getting her into a home, regardless of what she is and isn't saying about her service resistance. Frankly, it would be like a cancer patient and offering them a ride to Disney World without dealing with the fact that they first needed appropriate treatment. Well, what we found is that the best way to avoid, frankly, cooperating with the status quo is by rigorously focusing on the most obvious problem. And if it's homelessness, it's getting that person into a home. This truly is the pathway to innovation, the idea that you need to have a disciplined focus on the core problem, and anything else you do really has to support that outcome. Now, that doesn't mean in your kind of rigorous focus on those outcomes that you ignore the larger systems. Hardly. And in fact, the fourth step that we think is so significant is that you need to build the broadest possible team. One of the things about homelessness, but name that problem, is that the solutions to it live in many places. And what you need to do is bring them together into some sense of coherence. We were seeing that some of the most diligent communities around the country, they were taking at best months and often a year or more to get a single person housed because they were trying to line up apartments and get original copies of ID and get government subsidies in place and find the person, and it was just a complete mess. Yet when we started bringing together community by community, all of the players who had skin in the game, mayor's offices, health and mental health agencies, the housing authorities, shelter operators, not-for-profits, the VA, and actually help them function as one well-oiled housing placement machine, that's when you started seeing progress. And don't for a minute think that that's not uncomfortable for the people involved, because these are all folks that have been working in programs, and there's a difference between programs and what we were asking people to do, which is to participate in a new kind of process. And what that meant for them is that they had to start sharing information with each other, sharing data, sharing resources, sharing credit. They had to start questioning old assumptions and each other's rules. And they had to start taking responsibility for holding each other accountable for results. Not easy, but we have seen again and again that what holds that process together and what keeps people at the table is the power of that urgent, shared, and measurable goal. That's where the creativity comes from, and that's where the will to continue and to keep changing one system, that's where it comes from. And now finally, we think that, ironically enough, if you want to make big system changes, you actually have to experiment in really small cycles. You have to experiment, reflect, course correct, again and again and again. Essentially, you have to be willing to build the plane while you're flying it, and to start basically learning about whether what you're doing is working in real time. Now, most organizations believe in evaluation, but a lot of groups basically review what they've accomplished after a year, or they do a longitudinal study. That doesn't help you figure out what you're doing is actually something you're getting better at. And so what we've come to see is that the optimal way to really measure what you're doing is to try to do it in 100-day cycles. This is an idea we've taken from a close partner, the Rapid Results Institute. And that 100-day cycle both brings the urgency into play, but it allows you enough time to see if what you're doing and correcting and doing some more, is that really getting you results? So to review, focus on the outliers, set measurable goals with scary deadlines, do the most obvious thing first, build the widest possible team, and experiment in short cycles. We really think that this process can be applicable to many problems. And I would love to see people try it out. Love to know that it was helpful to you, whether you're in education or healthcare or whatever community problem you're working on. And let me tell you, we drink our own Kool-Aid on this. We believe in this process. In fact, just over 3 years ago, we stood up in front of about 1,000 of our closest friends and colleagues at the National Alliance to End Homelessness Conference and announced that we were going to help communities across the country house 100,000 of the most long-term and vulnerable homeless in the country by July 2014. Now, we trusted the process, we were on the road already, but we didn't stop to plan and strategize and do something elaborate. I mean, we had enough planning, we had enough strategy. And in fact, that's not the way innovation operates. You don't plan your way through an innovation process. And thank God we didn't, because now, 3 years in, over 73,000 people are housed in all of these communities, over 200 of them working together. And so let me leave you with a little bit of a forecast on our next big bet and how we're applying this process next. We think that we need an end game on homelessness, that we need to figure out how to stop it before it starts. And as we've dug into the data about where the conditions are found that are most likely to produce homelessness, again and again we find that in any city in this country, you're back to the neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. Neighborhoods like Brownsville in Brooklyn, New York. Well, in Brownsville, we've assembled a great team. We've set some really terrifying goals, and we are determined to help this community turn itself around using this process. Have no idea what this is going to look like. But if you ask me back in a few years, I'd be happy to fill you in. Thank you.